I get it.
You got it.
Okay, I get it.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
I think it's Easter that makes all the musicians get in tune. Everybody's practicing.
Yeah.
Yes, we told them that we actually got to bring the shroud, but I used OxyClean on it, and look what happened. You know, it was just terrible. So we have a friend who's a caterer, and she gives us some lovely linens.
Morning, Jim. You're muted, Jim.
Hello there. I guess we're ready to go.
We are indeed.
We'll start with yes, Grayson has the first. Hi, I'm James, and this is Grayson. We're the Van Camps, and we brought along our son Miles with us as well, and
Edna is here.
And Grayson's going to open with prayer. Are you not?
Well, yes. Actually, I have a little statement that, Pope Francis in 2015, Pope Francis went to Turin, where you'll see that's where the shroud is, and said the following words. He said, "The icon of Jesus' love is the shroud that even now has attracted so many people here to Turin. The shroud draws people to the tormented face and body of Jesus, and at the same time directs people towards the face of every suffering and unjustly persecuted person." And that's some of what I think of when I see the shroud. So let us pray. Lord Jesus Christ, through your passion, death, and resurrection, you redeem us and raise us to new life. Be with us now as we consider this shroud and ponder its significance and your suffering. Generations of believers have gazed upon this icon through the eyes of faith. As we reflect on the shroud, may we be moved not only by the image before us, but by the memory of your amazing love. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. And we're here to consider whether the Shroud of Turin is this mysterious and controversial image, or is it a work of art by an artist at some later time. Well, what is the first question that comes up? Well, what is the shroud and where is it? Well, where it is the city of Turin, or it's also known as Torino, in Italy, in the northern part of Italy. It's a piece of linen cloth, and it measures 14.5 feet long by 3.5 feet wide. And on that cloth is the image of the front and back of a man. And it rests in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist there in Turin. And if you look at the picture, that is a picture of the piazza, the outside of the cathedral there in Turin. And it is in Italy is referred to as the Holy Shroud of Turin, the Sacra Sindon. And it is probably the most famous and most debated religious relic. And as we're starting off here, please note that the photographs that I'm using for the presentation were provided by a man named Barry Schwartz. And Barry Schwartz was a photographer who photographed the shroud in 1978, but more on that later. But I owe him a gratitude and thanks for providing the images for us this morning. And the first word that we come up against is the word historicity. And when we think about did something actually happen? Is something a fact? And that's what the word historicity refers to, and can we say that the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, do they contain factual material? And then we come to the question, well, if the Gospels are factual, is the shroud factual? And then is the person of Jesus of Nazareth factual? And for most folks, it's a widely accepted fact to historians that there was a Jewish person named Jesus who was crucified by the Romans, and was this the Jesus of history, the Messiah? As the Son of God, as our creeds dictate. We know about the crucifixion. Again, we know that existed in history. And is there, then we come to the thing, is there some piece of evidence of that? And, in fact, many believe that the Shroud of Turin is, in fact, that relic or artifact of the crucifixion. It is as I said, it's 14 feet long and 3.5 feet wide. It's what's the actual fabric itself is what's called the 3-in-1 herringbone twill weave, which was a well-known weaving pattern in the Middle East. And in the center of the cloth is the front and back image of a man's body, and it attests to the historical fact of the crucifixion through it. And just a back channel kind of thing is that how I got involved and how we got aware of the shroud is that when I was before we actually moved to Glen Ellen, living back in New Jersey, I worked for a company that had business in the city of Turin, and we were there back in in the 1970s. I was there as early as 76, and on my trip there in 1978, Grayson came along with me, and I had mentioned to her about they have this shroud there in Turin, and we might get to see it. And it turned out that while the shroud was there in 1978, there was a big effort going on to document it and to photograph it and so forth. So we didn't get to see it.
We didn't get to see it. They had taken it down off the display.
But they do have a replica on display all the time there in the cathedral. And the first thing to talk about is that how the shroud is arranged in the body, and you can tell from this painting that was done in the 16th century exactly how it was arranged in the body. It was folded lengthwise over a body, and you can see how the image was created on the cloth. And that in the 16th century, when this painting, the artist that painted this painting, had to have seen the actual shroud, and you can see that the image on the shroud is quite distinct, certainly distinct enough for the artist to have copied it and gotten much of the detail that shows up on the shroud now in much fainter, but it was certainly quite visible in the 16th century.
And could I just say something here? If you'll notice these little dots, they will come up later. There's sort of 4 mysterious dots on the shroud
there's
in
lots
the
of
center.
Lots of detail that we'll be seeing on the shroud. And this is the present day front view of the shroud. And you can see some of the highlights of this are that you see this man lying on the shroud. Okay, you see, on the hands, you see, a wound okay, and evidence of blood that came from a wound on the hand, okay, and more about that later. You also see this dark stain here is a blood stain that comports with being stabbed with a spear. And you have droplets of blood, evidence of droplets of blood on the head that would be consistent with a crown of thorns. And as you can guess, there's lots of controversy about it, and for certainly since in the modern time, there's been, well, it was created in the Renaissance, and Leonardo da Vinci could have painted it, and it's really an artwork, and it would be heresy to even think of it being the actual shroud of Jesus Christ. Well, we're going to get into some of that. And first of all, in order to track it, there's the timeline of events that that historians have uncovered as to where the shroud has been, where it originated from, and part of this is I'm going to be walking through a timeline associated with the shroud, just to bring us up to the present time. And it starts with in the green block there, a man named Eusebius, and I'm going to read the narration here while you just look at the highlights on the screen here. In circa 314 AD, here we see this man Eusebius. Eusebius of Caesarea became the bishop of Caesarea Maritima. He is considered the father of church history. He did research in what were then archives in a place called Edessa. And 2 letters that he published in his history came from the archives of Edessa and have become known as the Abgar legend. And so he, who lived around 314, okay, he found evidence related to a person named Abgar, who was living at the time of Jesus. He was a contemporary of Jesus and lived in 30 AD. And according to the legend, there's a popular myth that Jesus had an exchange of letters with the king Abgar of Osroene, whose capital was Edessa, which is the predecessor of the modern city of Urfa, located in the southwest corner of Turkey. And the king suffered from leprosy, and he had heard that Jesus cured and healed many people, and so he wrote Jesus a letter and requested that Jesus come to Edessa to cure him. Jesus responded and said he would not be able to visit Edessa at that time, but he would send one of his disciples to, quote, heal your disease and give life to you and yours. And according to the legend, a disciple named Thaddeus did eventually come after Jesus' death and resurrection, bearing with him a holy cloth imprinted with the Savior's image. And at the sight of the cloth, Abgar was cured and the Christian faith was established in that city. And so here we have King Abgar in Edessa at the time of Christ, having this miraculous event occur, and mentioning a cloth with an image on it. And that was all fine until Abgar died. His heirs returned to their old ways, and the cloth disappears from historical record. And until nearly 500 years later, in 525 AD, they were repairing a wall around the city of Edessa, and they found in the wall, sealed and tucked away within a niche, the very cloth that it contained the image of Jesus. Again, this is not conjecture about the cloth being found in 525. It actually is recorded as an accepted fact of history that there was a cloth, a relic of the crucifixion that appears, and it reappears in 525 AD. Moving on from there, we all know from the historical record about Constantine and Constantinople in the Eastern, in what was then the Eastern Church before the Church in Rome. And so a little about 400 years later, in 944, we have Constantine, and it was handed over to the shroud was handed over to an army from Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Empire, where the shroud was revered as the true likeness of Jesus Christ. Carrying on, moving forward, along comes the Crusades, and they proceed to sack Constantinople in 1204 AD, and the linen cloth disappears from Constantinople and probably brought back to Western Europe by the Crusaders. And then we have a period where we're not sure who had the shroud, but it's thought that a group called the Knights Templar, who were the soldiers of the crusade, had possession of the shroud from about 1204 to 1357. So it's in Western Europe by 1204, probably under the care of the Knights Templar, until about 1307, when the King Philip the Fair of France, who was an enemy of the Templars, suppressed the order, and he imprisoned its members and killed many of them. And one of the high-ranking officers of the Knights Templar was the master of the Knights Templar. His name was Geoffrey de Charnay. So we see over here the name of Geoffrey de Charnay, who was a Knights Templar. His name is virtually the same as the first known owner of the Shroud of Turin, a man named Geoffrey de Charnay of Lire. And there's a different spelling. The A is not in there, but it's still quite possible that Geoffrey was has the same name. He could be a cousin, some descendant of the Knights Templar, Geoffrey de Charnay. And there we find him in France in 1350 AD. And as it turns out, that that's where we pick up the story, actually in and around, or on its way to Turin. He comes in possession of the shroud, and he died in battle. His son, Geoffrey II, he died in 1398, and then that son's daughter was without child, and towards the end of her life, Margaret de Charnay deeded the shroud to a person called Louis of Savoy, and that's in 1453 in a place called Chambéry, France. And it was known that the Pope Sixtus IV, let it be known that he regarded the shroud as an authentic relic, and a special chapel with a silver-lined cabinet was built in Chambéry, France. And then we have this mysterious yellow circle here that turns out to be talking about the fire, okay? The fire happens in 1532 as a crisis in the life of the shroud when a fire broke out in the chapel and raged around the silver-lined reliquary where the shroud lay folded in the box, in the reliquary. And the melting point of silver being what it is, the fire melted the silver lining, and then that piece of the molten silver fell on the folded cloth and burned through the cloth at the edges of it. And fortunately, one of the counselors of the Duke and two Franciscan priests were able to carry the burning casket out of the building and doused it with water, extinguishing the blaze. And so preserved it for some later time. And that is where the history of it, where the location of the shroud has been there in Turin after it was brought there by the Duke of Savoy, Louis of Savoy, and the Savoy dynasty were the ruling family of Italy.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
There are triangles of fabric that were inserted. Were they inserted then? I know that.
Yeah, there was at the time of following the fire, the repairs were made to the shroud, and you will see on the subsequent photographs, and I will point them out to you as we proceed here. So, from the 16th century up until the 19th century, the shroud's there in Turin, and we have the first modern evidence of the Shroud of Turin and the images on it through the photographs that were taken. And here is a picture of a man named Secondo Pia. And in 1898, in preparation for the celebration of the 400th anniversary of the cathedral in Turin and the 50th anniversary of the Italian Constitution, they were going to have a big celebration. And as part of that, there was a sacred art exhibit, and they wanted to include the shroud for that. And the current Duke of Savoy, the King of Italy, as it turns out, his permission was needed in order to display the shroud. And at first they did not have that permission, and paintings were, replicas were painted of the shroud, but were never used. And I couldn't even find today any photographs of the actual paintings that were created. Hoping, still to promote the attendance to the celebration, permission was eventually granted to photograph the shroud. And this person here, Secondo Pia, who was a lawyer by trade and only an amateur photographer, he was chosen to do the job of taking the pictures of the shroud. And so since the event, the celebration had already started, he had to hurry up to make his arrangements. And it turns out that this is one of the first times that electric light was used to take a photograph. You remember that Thomas Edison had only invented the light bulb some almost 20 years later. And so there's a lot of logistics involved with this. And there wasn't even any electricity in the cathedral. So Secondo had to bring a generator there. And he brought a generator and hooked up his electric lights and made a few exposures on that first day. and took them back to his dark room to develop them, and they were not successful. There was nothing that they could see. So he returns 3 days later at night, in the middle of the night, because the cathedral would be closed then, and set up his equipment again. And he, adjusted his exposure times as would any good photographer, learning from their mistakes. And so at about midnight, they came back to their photo lab and started to develop the plates, okay, and understand that the first, in this digital age, only those of us who have lived through the age of film photography understand what negatives and positives are, what negatives are, and what prints are. And so the first part of the process is to develop the negative plate. Okay, and of course, this was a glass plate during the time of, it wasn't a plastic strip of film negative, but a glass plate. And when he saw the image being developed, this is what he saw. He saw this image, and he later stated that he almost dropped the glass plate and broke it, okay, because what he saw was instead of seeing a negative image, he saw a positive image on the glass. It showed a positive image of a man and a face in detail that could not be seen with the naked eye. You could not see it actually on the cloth. And just to further educate us on that, here's what we're seeing here. On the left, you see the positive image, the actual picture of the shroud as it appeared then and as it appears today, okay? And it's quite faint. You can't see a lot of detail in it. But on the right is the negative of that was obtained when you take a picture of the thing. So you can see this entire shroud in the negative image here on the right, and the actual shroud itself that was photographed. And so that's just to understand, for those who aren't analog photographers, but digital photographers, okay, on the left here, you can see this is what Pia expected to see when he developed his negatives, that the parts of the image that are light colored on a negative are dark, okay? So the face of this person is dark, while their hair, which is in reality dark, shows up as white on the negative. And then, but that's not what he saw. He expected to see that. And what he saw was this, which is the positive image, where the light parts of the parts of the face that are lighted are light, okay? And that's the surprise that confronted the photographer at the very start. So now we're all educated about positives and negatives.
Even the young one.
Yeah, all you younglings have never seen a film negative. And once again, coming back to the photographic image of the shroud, okay? And, okay, it's a detailed image of a man on a cloth. Yes, that's true. Well, how does that match details that are found in the gospel? Okay,
Or does it at all?
Or does it? Well, let's consider some of that. And here's the here's from one of the Gospels. And so Pontius Pilate, willing to content the people, released Barabbas unto them and delivered Jesus, whom he had scourged, to be crucified. Okay, he scourged him, and lo and behold, there are marks on the body which are consistent with someone who has been whipped. Well, what else? Well, and they clothed him with purple and platted a crown of thorns and put it about his head. And yes, on the shroud, there's evidence of drops of blood from the head that would be consistent with having had a crown of thorns on your head that would cause you to bleed. The soldiers therefore came, talking about at the site of the crucifixion, and they came and broke the legs of the first man who had been crucified with Jesus, and then the other. But when they came to Jesus, they noted that he was already dead. They did not break his legs. Okay, and if you look at the image here of his legs on the shroud, his legs have not been broken. And instead, one of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. Okay, and this is consistent with the stain on the side. It's a blood stain that has been analyzed by people who have studied the shroud and concluded that it is blood. So there we have 4 instances where what the gospel said is comports with what we see in the image of Jesus on the shroud.
James, what are the triangular shapes? There's a total of 8 of them.
That's exactly what Grayson was referring to earlier. These lines here, okay, these lines that are both on either side of them are the burn marks from when the silver melted. And if you were to take, you can see that this little round thing here.
Yes.
Okay, that matches up with this, which matches up with another one here, because this was folded over, and so it went through 3 layers and burned through. Whoop.
Go back.
And when they went to repair it, the nuns at the church there put these cloth patches over the places where the silver had burned through the cloth.
Thank you.
That is confusing.
Yeah, Grayson and I talked about this while we were preparing. Exactly.
How did they fold it? Like the long where
Long
it was
axis.
burned. That was technically the edge at the time because it had been folded in, right?
Yeah. So this.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you folded it in, and they overlap because it burned through 3 layers. And you go back. So then.
No, you forgot one.
No, we showed them.
Oh, the
Okay.
wrist. You didn't do
Yeah.
the wrist.
Did we see on the final?
No, you didn't
We're
do
going to go back up here, and yeah,
This one.
the one that we, you could see here a wound at the wrist. I think we
didn't
we'll talk about that a little later.
Okay.
But there are more images here and more detail. And here's an image, the back view, okay, because both the front and the back of the image, okay, are on the cloth, and the back you could also see the evidence of having a crown of thorns placed on the head and causing bleeding on the back of the head. And then only since the photographs were taken could you see the detail about the scourging. Okay, and here's a close-up of the back view on the shoulders, and you see very peculiar, very interesting marks here that it turns out, and based upon modern archaeologists understanding what the actual whip that was used would have been like during the Roman times, and in fact a flagrum, which was used to flagellate, okay, to whip had metal balls attached to it at the ends. Okay, so it wasn't just leather, but at the ends of it they had tied leather, metal balls, and they create this peculiar dot. These two dots, on each strike, you see the marks of two dots that are the marks that were left by the metal balls on the whip itself. Now, and here's a close-up view, and of course here is the later on, remember the story about Thomas, and Thomas said, I don't believe, and so Christ said, put your fingers here, see my hands, reach out with your hand and put your hand into my side, stop doubting and believe. And there's the mark of the nail in the hands, and here's the evidence of his side, and the bleeding from being stabbed with a spear, and that comports with the gospel. And once again, a close-up showing more of the evidence of the scourging on the back of Jesus. Now, about considering the linen, the cloth that was used to wrap the body, we have the gospel passages about buying fine linen and wrapped him, and then Peter later on going and finding the linen clothes, and several passages. And so once again, going back and looking at this artistic representation of the shroud from the 16th century, we can see the linen. And a lot of the controversy that has arisen around the genuineness of the cloth, of the shroud, has to do with the cloth. And in 1978, as we talked about at the beginning there, when Grayson and I were in Turin and were not able to actually see the shroud, what was going on was this thing that they call STURP, which is the Shroud of Turin Research Project. Okay, so a number of scientists were called upon from various disciplines to come to Turin and to examine the shroud and to take samples of the shroud, of the cloth, to try to date the cloth. And so this was where the man who's provided the pictures, okay, he was the photographer who in 1978, this Barry Schwartz, he was the photographer that went to Turin and was involved with this research project. So they were looking to determine how old is the cloth. Okay? Is it really consistent with a piece of cloth that existed at the first century? Does it resemble the textiles that were predominant in that part of the world in the first century? And so samples were taken in 1978. This was the first really any scientific analysis of the cloth, and has led to many years of controversy over and debate over the validity of the conclusions that were drawn at the time. And one of the, we have all heard a lot about carbon dating and the use of carbon dating to establish in time the age of ancient relics, things from the pyramids and things from ancient civilizations. Wherever there is a carbon relic, okay, a piece of wood, a piece of cloth, anything that has carbon in it, it can be dated using special techniques that were actually developed at first to look at relics that were brought out of the pyramids of Egypt, and they were pretty much comported and agreed with the Egyptian dynastic list, the dating of the Egyptian dynasties, throughout history. And they were, when the dynastic list was saying it was somewhere in the neighborhood of 2700 BC, the carbon dating system, agreed with that. They were able to conclude from the scientific study that pretty well agrees. So that was sort of validated. That was the first ability to validate the actual carbon dating system. So they used it on the pieces the samples that they took from the shroud, and lo and behold, they said, well, this thing was this fabric comes from the 14th century. Therefore, hey, this must be some work of art. It's not the shroud of Jesus. It doesn't come from the 1st century. Well, the more that people have continued to study this, they have uncovered factors, affecting this carbon dating that bring those conclusions into question. And to some extent, my scientific background, brought me to have a strong point of view on this whole subject. One of the factors had to do with where you sampled. Where did they take the fibers that they carbon dated? Okay, where did those fibers come from? Well, do you think that the conservators, the people there in Turin, would allow them to take samples from the actual image of Christ, of Jesus, on the fabric? Would they be allowed to sample, here in the middle of the fabric? No, of course they wouldn't allow them to sample that part of it. They would allow them to sample the edges of the fabric, right? They would take samples from along the edges of the fabric where the image, where there was no image, but you could look at the fibers. And so they would sample those fibers. Well, imagine, if you will, okay, here's a piece of paper that I have, and this paper came from 2,000 years ago, and I hand it to Miles, okay, and he hands it to Edna, okay, and he hands it back to me, and I hand it to Grayson, okay.
I'm the worst.
And we didn't touch it in the middle. We touched it on the edges. So any if I can leave a fingerprint on this piece of paper or on a piece of cloth, okay, I'm transferring the oils in my skin, molecules of my skin that were created in the 21st century.
Breakfast.
Okay, or evidence of my breakfast this morning, crumbs or whatever. So any samples that were taken from the edge of the cloth would be contaminated by newer carbon than was there in the original first century. So that immediately moves the dating from the 1st century up into and so you could expect to see 14th century or even later time. So they're looking at the sort of the average, if you will. And then furthermore, one of the things that we teach to our people in the business of water treatment has to do with the fact that there are that microbial bacteria and so forth like to grow on surfaces, and that most of the contamination from systems like water systems or whatever on the surfaces of the pipes, not necessarily in the water that's flowing through the pipes. So we know that that microbes like to live on surfaces, and when microbes replicate, they would further contaminate the organic materials on the edge of the cloth with new carbon that was taken out of the atmosphere in order to sustain their life cycle. So a lot of problems with dating of the shroud based upon the samples that were taken on the edges of the shroud. Well, then the question comes up of how could the image be created or fabricated? If it is not a work of art, or if we could date the fabric in fact to the 1st century, then we're going to need to come up with some other explanation for the image that's on the fabric. How could it be created or fabricated? If you don't believe that that it is an image of an actual person from the 1st century, how could you have created it? And if it was happening in the 14th century, how could he have painted it in the negative form? There was no such thing as photography in the 4th century. No artist, no person living would know that to create an image that would be essentially a negative, okay, because the concept hadn't existed until the 19th century. And if you thought you were going to paint it on there, okay, because of the size of the cloth, being it's 14 feet long, okay, and because the image is so faint, in order to see the image, you would have to stand back from the canvas, if you will, quite far, which would require a very long paintbrush. Okay, well, that creates a lot of problems with trying to say that it was painted by an artist on there, drawn by an artist on there, and is it a result of some chemistry from decomposing flesh reacting with linen? Well, numerous attempts to duplicate, to create this effect using all the science that we have today have been unsuccessful. They've not been able to come up with a way of fabricating this kind of an image on this material. And for those who say, well, the 14th century date is the first is correct. We have also a piece of something called the Prey Codex, okay, that was created in a sort of an illuminated manuscript, if you will. It was dated to the late 12th or early 13th century, which is before the dating of the cloth. And this codex has an illustration, shows the body of Christ being prepared for burial, and you can see that showing him with his hands crossed, like you see on the shroud, and then the fact that you don't see the thumbs, which is, we hadn't even mentioned that, but you see 4 fingers, but you don't see the thumb in the images. And some folks have opined that that could be as a result of the damage to the hand, that the thumb would be drawn in by the damage to the hand. The fabric shows a herringbone pattern, as you see by, if we zoom in on that image, in the lower part of that image, you see that they're showing a piece of cloth that has a pattern that's consistent with a herringbone pattern, similar to the weaving of the shroud. And then there are 4 tiny circles, okay, on that are shown here in the shape of an L that that appear perfectly reproduce the, there's 4 holes in the actual shroud that they call them the poker holes, in the shape of an L on the Turin shroud. So here's something from the 12th century before the fire. Okay, it's before the carbon dating on the shroud, that suggests that somebody in the 12th century or whatever saw the shroud and then drew this picture in the what's called the Prey Codex. In addition, we're just about finished here. The botanical, they've sampled the cloth and find pollen specimens on the fabric. 31 of them were from plants indigenous to the region of Palestine, and only 17 were from plants that are found in France and Italy, where the shroud has been since the 14th century. Recent conclusions reached by expert studies of the shroud are,
You want me to read it?
Yeah.
Number 1, the image is superficial.
on the surface.
Second, the image is photographically negative. The image is composed of degraded or dehydrated cellulose fibers. The image radiates outwards from the light, like the light from a bulb.
It's not going straight up. That
Right, it
it
just-
goes this way
Right.
out through the cloth.
Number 5, the image is extremely detailed to a forensic degree. 6, the image is thermally and chemically stable.
If it it has survived through the heat of a fire and so forth.
7, the image is water insoluble because it had been wet at one point.
If it had been painted with any paint or anything that was like a watercolor, all that image would have been blurred at the very least or washed away when the fire happened and they doused it. They put the fire out with water.
Okay. 8, the image is infrared positive.
Yeah.
The image is sepia toned, and the blood was present before the image was formed. I don't know how they knew that, but that's interesting. And the blood is human blood. 12, the color spectrum of the image is similar to that of a scorch mark on a fabric. And number 13, even in the 21st century, the image has never been successfully duplicated, which I find interesting. Number 14, absolutely no pigments, powders, dyes, or paints were used. The image agrees with the specifics found in the Gospels, and the image is encoded with 3D information.
And what?
Yes.
Okay, that last one there at 3D information. Let's quickly talk about 3D information. Something called the VP8, okay, was a 1970s era analog image analyzer. Before, there weren't a lot of computers around then, and more sophisticated recent tools similar to that are used to map the topography of the moon, for example. And so when this early version of a topographic analyzer was used, it was analyzing the image. It yields vertical relief. It yields an image that comes up into 3 dimensions. And the staining on the shroud is a function of the distance of the fabric from the features of the face, for example. Since the nose is close to the fabric, it stained the cloth more densely, the image of that, okay? And the hollows of the face, which are further away, stained it very little. Thus, the image produces a 3D effect. And here is that image. And we can see here, we're also seeing, we see the image of Jesus on here. We see his hand, okay? We see we'd see that he has long hair. Okay, there's 3-dimensional imaging, and here's the close-up of the face imaging. And one thing that we failed to mention, okay, is this image of the hand, okay? And I don't know how I forgot to mention that.
I
but-
tried.
Okay, you tried. That since the earliest depictions of crucifixion in art, okay, that were from maybe the 6th century on, okay, when you show Christ being crucified, they show the nails going through the palm of the hand, okay, and that is not anatomically correct, okay. If you were to actually drive a nail through the hand and try to suspend a body from that, it would immediately tear through, because there's only flesh between the middle of the palm and so you would but on the shroud, the image is actually in the wrist, that the nail did not go through the palm of the hand like all of the artistic representations of crucifixion are, but through the wrist, where you'd have the wrist bones that could hold the weight, okay, of a body if it were suspended from the nails, which is
It's just a bad reading, it's bad understanding of the translation.
because the words in the Greek that are used to say hand can include everything, okay, including the wrist. Mm-hmm. And this is what you would see if you took a regular photograph, okay, and subjected it to this VP analyzer, how it distorts the features, and you don't get an image like you find on the shroud.
That's very strange.
So that we come to the end of our study here, just in time, and one thing, just that there's resources that you can find online. There's actually a book that you can download. You download you get a free download of a PDF file from a site called theshroudofturin.org. Barry Schwartz, of course, has a website with so many of the photographs that he took, and it was an interesting and when I found his website, just as a sort of a personal note on this thing, that was very interesting. I said, oh, here's a phone number associated with this shroud.com website by Barry Schwartz. I'll just call it, find it, see if anybody answers. I don't know how long that website's been up. Maybe there's no longer anybody there. So I called up the number, and lo and behold, Barry Schwartz picked up the phone, okay? And so here I am, I'm talking to the person that actually took all the photographs and has spent much of his career since 1978 studying the shroud and using what he coming to his own conclusions about it, and
He's not a
shares
believer.
with me. He's not a believer. He's a Jew. Okay, Barry Schwartz is a Jewish man, and so all the more reason for him to have been the photographer and to be documenting this thing, because he's not there trying to prove that it is the shroud of Christ, because he is still waiting for the Messiah,
Right.
I guess. And so he had done all this work and studied it and came to his own conclusions about it, and presented his, said, I'm going to talk to my mother about this and explain what I found, okay? And so he says to his mother, a Jewish woman, okay, so what do you think? And she says, of course it's the real thing. She says, she had no trouble at all accepting his. Why would that be? Well, at the time of Christ, graven images were a big no-no within Judaism. You did not make pictures of things and have objects, of their idols, okay? Because they were not like the pagans. You couldn't make a picture of God. You couldn't even write his name, right? You couldn't speak his name. And so there would have to have been something very special about this piece of cloth that they would have preserved it, considering it would be anathema to their own beliefs. And so, of course, it's the genuine thing. And I thought that was a very revealing comment by Mr. Schwartz on the subject. And I leave you all today to contemplate for yourself.
But when I contemplate it, I think about Hiroshima and the images after a nuclear explosion. And I would love to somehow have somebody talk about, could that be what happened when Jesus was resurrected? Was it something like a nuclear explosion coming, out from all sides of the cloth? And that's just me, a layperson, thinking about that. Goodbye.
So thank you all for
Thanks for your
listening.
study.
If you have any questions, please feel free to get in touch with me.
He's in the directory.
Yeah.